Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am just about to start trade show season at my day job. The good thing is that the first couple of them are in New York City, so I won't be traveling particularly far. The other major ones this year turn out to be in Philadelphia and Boston this spring. I mean, fall is a completely different beast. Those are May and June, so no flying, which is nice because I'm kind of trying to avoid that until we can unplug the FAA and restart it, I guess. But I've also got Rotterdam and London during that stretch. There's a Berlin show too, but it overlaps with a domestic conference, so I'm just going to do a remote presentation for that one. But it's one of those aspects of what I do for a living that I've sort of accommodated myself to since 1999, even with the trade magazine before I launched a trade association, that these conferences and exhibitions are the gathering places, the regular annual thing. And I have to remind myself that that is not something that normal people do at work. Even my comics friends, yeah, there are, festivals and there's a circuit of that stuff, but little different, I guess. So anyway, all of this is partly my way of saying we may not have an episode next week. I've recorded a couple with guests whose books are coming out in April and don't want to post those before their pub date. And things have gotten weird. And it turns out I have a hole for the March 18th slot. It might end up getting filled during the New York trip. We'll see. But if not, the show is going to be dark that week. Or I could record a monologue in my hotel room in Weehawken, New Jersey, in which case it'll be really dark. But anyway, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is Elon Green, and he has an amazing new book out, The Man Nobody Killed, Life, Death, and Art in Michael Stewart's New York. It's from Celadon Books, and it's about the 1983 death of Michael Stewart, this Black artist. While he was in police custody, the book is about Michael, about his death, and about the aftermath of his killing, the investigation, and everything else that goes on in New York around it. Michael Stewart was a 25-year-old artist, model, and DJ in New York City when he was grabbed by transit cops for allegedly tagging a subway station wall. That's questionable anyway, there's a lot in this stuff that doesn't add up. But the story takes a really terrible turn after he gets pinched by the cops. Witnesses describe him just taking a terrible beating at the hands of multiple transit cops, nightsticks, billy club, choking, etc. Then he gets hogtied for transport to Bellevue, to the hospital, and no heartbeat when he arrives. Staff manages to keep him alive for 13 comatose days before he died, but it's just terrible. And Elon, he goes deep into the investigation into Stewart's killing, his own investigation, and the investigation that took place then. And he speaks to witnesses, police, a judge, and other figures involved in the case, as well as poring over news reports, court transcripts, and all the documentation of that era. And the process really brings that New York to life with his prose. I mean, he brings us as much of a biography of Stewart as you can, given how short his life was and how everything was sort of ahead of him. But then he sort of broadens the canvas to take in the city, but also America in that early 80s Reagan world. And it doesn't hurt that Stewart's life as an artist and DJ and model brought him into proximity the great village art scene of that era. So you get sightings of Keith Haring and Basquiat and Madonna and others, but it's not, it's not salacious by any means. And Elon brings them in appropriately in the context of Michael's death and what it meant to the village, what it meant to New York. And he brings us so much more of that New York City and the nature of police brutality at the time and how that changed the politics of the era. When I say he brings it to life, I mean, his writing evokes the whole sensory palette of that New York. You really feel the city as you turn the pages, and you feel such sadness and sympathy for Stewart and his family, and the sense of futility that goes into the court cases as they try to bring charges against the police who were involved. The book is really an amazing visit to another time that's not so different from ours. And I'm just glad that multiple guests of the show last year, Eric Drucker and Benjamin Dreyer, both come to mind. There are probably more than that, told me not to sleep on this one. I always ask, what are you reading? And they're like, I'm really looking forward to Elon Green's book about Michael Stewart. And that brought us here. So go get The Man Nobody Killed, out now from Celadon Books. Now here's Elon's bio from the book. Elon Green has written for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the Columbia Journalism Review, and appears in Unspeakable Acts, Sarah Weinman's anthology of true crime. Last Call, a true story of love, lust, and murder in queer New York, was his first book and won the Edgar Award for Best Fact Crime. He was an executive producer on the HBO series adapted from Last Call. His new book is The Man Nobody Killed. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Elon Green. Tell me where the Man Nobody Killed came from. How did you get into Michael Stewart's case?
I wish I had a better answer than a Wikipedia entry, but that's the reality. I read this fairly short but fascinating Wikipedia entry, and I thought it was so interesting that my assumption was that there were already 2 or 3 books written about the case. And I was frankly shocked to discover that nobody had gone back in the intervening almost 40 years to revisit it. Some of the early people that I started calling were the witnesses, and they all had some version of what took you so long, and I knew very early on that this was a very special story and quite frankly had been overlooked.
So I guess to jump to the big meta question, what did take so long? Why do you think there was no investigation, no nonfiction long-form investigation of this before?
I thought I would come up with a theory at this point, but I don't know. It's not as... I don't know. I suppose you could say that, people were consumed by writing about the early years of the AIDS epidemic, which is sort of in the background of the story. Maybe there were so many other things going on in New York at the time that people just didn't bother with this police brutality case. But I don't know. It doesn't make a great deal of sense why a story involving Madonna and Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring would have escaped real scrutiny for so long, with the incredibly notable exception of the Guggenheim exhibit in 2019.
Sure. I was thinking when I recorded last year with Brad Gooch for his Keith Haring biography, there was a sense of not exactly the same thing. Obviously, Haring had, all the public acclaim and appeal, but still that sense of really somebody going into the life decades and decades later. I guess it raises the question of how challenging was the research for you, given just the time lapse from the event of Stewart's murder. We'll call it a murder, right?
No.
Okay, Stewart's death.
I mean,
Stewart's death. Yeah.
It's not legally a murder.
Yeah. And that's where I guess I'm jumping the gun a bit much there.
I mean, you're welcome to call it that, but yes.
No, I understand. The death of Michael Stewart, we'll say. But again, the way memories lapse, and also the sources who died in the intervening time, what was the toughest part of research for it?
Well, the early 80s, obviously there's always going to be a swath of the population that doesn't make it out of the 80s because of the AIDS epidemic, because of heroin and all sorts of drugs. But I was lucky in that a lot of the people that witnessed the beating, that were friends with Michael, were in their early 20s. And so I had a large number of people that were still contactable and were willing to talk to me. As far as non-primary sources, interview sources, there was a tremendous amount of archival material sitting in the municipal archives, the New York Public Library, people's attics. This was an event that people understood in real time was a huge deal, and so they saved stuff. You had the lawyers for the police saving material. You had Michael's friends saving material, filmmakers, but I also think that was more the mentality of the era, is that people were willing to, put hard copy material into boxes and keep it till it was needed.
Did the story change from what you thought it was going in?
Yes. I mean, the one that I think about the most is when I first began the story, I assumed that everybody's idea of a cover-up in the chief medical examiner's office was true. That was a very seductive story as a writer, to think that the chief medical examiner of New York had engineered a cover-up to benefit the police. And that didn't turn out to be true, contrary to what almost everybody believed. It's not as if the medical examiner, Elliot Gross, was a flawless human being by any means. He made mistakes. But from what I could find, basically everything he did was at least explicable, and there was no malice behind any of it. And what was interesting to me is that while there wasn't this cover-up that people believed had happened, there was, to my mind, a cover-up that nobody noticed, which was that Internal Affairs, blatantly refused to investigate the case, which by statute they had to do.
And you get at that in the beginning, and I don't mean it as a knock on your side. It's never explained as to why they refused to get involved, and they shunted it off to the other department, the other investigators.
Well, this is one of those situations where the person who could probably answer that question is dead. Yeah.
And maybe wouldn't have answered it to your satisfaction, not to corroborate a story, but to give you any conclusiveness.
Perhaps not, but you'd be surprised by the stuff that people are willing to say on the record.
Before we get to that, I do want to point out, from my work as a lobbyist / dealing with the federal government, I've learned that vis-a-vis the cover-up idea, things that I ascribe, well, in the previous administrations, things I ascribe to malevolence turn out to just be, we'll say, ignorance or negligence, as opposed to somebody actually having it in my case, a particular industry sector. But I've learned more and more dealing with government that tends to be more the case, that they just don't know what they're doing, as opposed to, having it in for you. The current administration notwithstanding, and we'll maybe get into that later. But along those lines, do people, you talked about a few people, particularly a judge who 40 years later talks about, we'll say reservations or what they really think happened or should have happened in relation to the case. How much of that did you find in terms of people decades later really having a change of perspective on what they saw?
Not often, which was why the interview that I did with the judge
it stands out, certainly.
Stands out. It was quite jarring to me. I mean, when I called him, generally judges don't talk to journalists, and certainly they don't talk in any great depth to journalists. And so when I called the judge, I was expecting, a short conversation at best. And I believe we stayed on the phone for nearly 3 hours. It was pretty clear when he started to talk that he hadn't gotten a chance to talk about the case in the intervening decades. And he had a lot that he'd been thinking about and wanted to discuss. And it was a real outpouring of, ideas, emotions. It seemed to me that he was almost having an epiphany in real time about what he was thinking about all of this. And so, throughout our conversation, I kept asking him how he felt about the verdict. And, he sort of kicked aside the question, but finally, maybe because he was tired of me asking it, he finally did answer it. And I think he surprised himself as much as he surprised me in saying that he felt it had been wrongly decided.
The twists and turns you take us through from the initial grand jury to the second one to the charges that were initially filed and then what goes on trial. It's really, it walks you through aspects of the judicial system in ways that can be maddening. And then you see what somebody's thoughts like this were decades and decades later, how, even when the process was followed, he still felt, things did not go the way they should have. It's, I'll say disheartening. I don't
know. I came away from this also feeling differently about the case than I expected to. I mean, I tend to agree with, one of the jurors I talked to said, look, we all knew that absent the actions of the police, Michael Stewart would still be alive. But of course, with the legal system, it's not, knowing something intuitively is not good enough. You have to be able to prove it. And, for a number of reasons, including the vacillations of the medical examiner, the prosecution just couldn't quite tell the story that they needed to tell. And so while, I find the idea that these police were not held to account nauseating, I absolutely understand why ultimately the jury just couldn't settle on a conviction.
Yeah, the medical section in that second, in the trial itself, really, you carry across that confusion and that doubt very, very effectively. So I will say it reminded me of the William Gaddis line from a Frolic of His Own. In the next world, you get justice. In this world, you get the law. And that's, I think partly why your subtitle is Life, Death, and Art and not, Justice in Michael Stewart's New York.
That would have made a good epigraph.
Yeah, you can use that for the paperback edition if you want. I'll zap it over after, but But tell me about, though, the experience of stretching beyond Michael Stewart into greater New York in that early 80s phase. I'm in my mid-50s. I live in northern New Jersey. I live in the house I grew up in, so I've always had New York media and tabloid media around since the early 70s. So all of this stuff to me was, on Channel 4, on, in the newspapers, on the radio. What was your experience sort of expanding the story beyond just Michael Stewart into into what was going on in New York in that space of time?
I mean, it was...
I should ask how old you are. I don't know if you're in your mid-50s. I assume anyone accomplished is younger than me because I'm at that age.
I'm 40. I'm 45.
Okay.
And I grew up in Connecticut, but, I had family in New York. I had family on Long Island. So, I grew up seeing, Gabe Pressman on TV, looking through Newsday. And, certainly the experience of writing and reporting this was in part sort of delving into these parts of my childhood that I kind of half remembered, but didn't really know anything about. And, that was really a fascinating experience to, sit down and write an entire chapter about Gabe Pressman and to find out sort of what a remarkable person he was. And how much he had accomplished, and to look at the, sort of tabloid landscape of the era, not just Jimmy Breslin, who everybody knows, but also Murray Kempton and Leonard Levitt and all these people that were really not just, it wasn't just a first draft of history, it was like the only draft of history, because oftentimes they were the only ones in the room.
Yeah.
And that was, as a journalist looking back on an event 40 years later, that's a real gift.
And it helps that Murray Kempton was way up there as a prose writer too. Ron Rosenbaum turned me on to him decades ago, and that was you could actually write like this in a newspaper. Huh. Okay. That's anyway, a little aside about Kempton in particular.
No, I mean, look, when you always have to sort of be judicious about who you're quoting, and with Kempton, the only danger is wanting to quote too much.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a remarkable writer, but so really brought you into that. Again, to me, that's the New York of my 10 into 20-year-old phase, so I was always hearing, basically, the moment you started expanding, I was thinking, boy, Eleanor Bumpurs is going to come up at some point, and she does. Bernie Getz simultaneously. A much bigger story in Getz's case, but these were all the things that were...
These stories were not just in the air. These were genuinely related to the Stewart case.
Oh, yeah. I didn't feel like you were just gratuitously bringing them in. They all add to the whole shebang. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it wasn't a stretch to bring them in because they were all talked about in the same breath. The Getz case, the Bumpurs case, and the Stewart case were all considered significant headaches for Robert Morgenthau. And they were all sort of different symptoms of the same underlying condition.
Has a condition changed?
No.
I'm trying to be charitable. How does that New York contrast with besides body cameras and all the cell phones and everything else? How alien was that New York to you, I guess? Both in terms of just, what it was, and then, that police violence environment.
I mean, I still certainly remembered like bits and pieces of that as a kid. I mean, I remember the old Times Square. But as far as the experience of being black in New York in the early 80s, that was completely alien to me, because how could it not be? And, also by the time I moved to New York in the early 2000s, pretty much every trace of that is gone.
Yeah, my story I've told on the show before, my mother used to, in like 82, 83, bring me and my brother in to the city. She would go to the 2-for-1 ticket place in Times Square and leave the two of us in like a pinball arcade, which now would get you arrested if you did that with your children. But
Right.
we'd just sit there trying to, turn the games on and off to get free games while guys were just nodding in the corner, shut up. And she was trying to get, 2-for-1 tickets to a chorus line. So yeah, it was
Yeah, look, I got my first fake ID in Times Square. In,
your first nunchucks and throwing stars too. So
1996, for $10. It's
yeah, it was a different world. So
yeah.
tell me about your interest in criminal justice and we'll say racial justice in relation to the Stewart book, but where did your background, how did you get involved in writing about criminal justice? I'll just put it in those terms.
Honestly, I'm not really sure. I think you end up writing stuff that you want to read.
Yeah.
But the writers that I most admired, both growing up, but also when I was developing as a journalist myself, an early one was actually Mr. Rosenbaum, who I knew when I was at the New York Observer.
Oh, wow.
But, I grew up reading, Baldwin and Langston Hughes. And, when I started writing myself, I was reading David Grann and a lot of these writers just were tackling issues that were larger than sort of the proximate story, mm-hmm. larger than the crime at the center of whatever story they were telling. And, to me, those were always the most interesting works. On some level, all homicides are the same. They're bloody and they're awful, and someone has died. But it's what's going on around them that for me makes them stand out.
Yeah, I think that was always the Ron lesson of less about the phenomenon, more about our interpretations of the phenomenon and what they mean too.
I think that's right, but I mean, for me,
but you're going a different direction than that for sure. Yeah,
I've also always had a fascination with, I think the sensory experience of reading and writing. So, certainly starting with Last Call, I thought a lot about what it would be like to walk through the spaces I was writing about, mm-hmm. because of course I couldn't, with one or two exceptions. And so I was always thinking about, well, okay, what did this look like? What did this sound like? Why did, a particular bar exist in a particular place? And why did it attract a particular clientele? Because ultimately, when you're answering questions like that, you are tackling larger stories. Whether you're asking about the East Village in The Man Nobody Killed, well, why did the Pyramid Club attract the people it did? And ultimately, the answers will involve housing and the fiscal crisis and all sorts of other, larger topics.
Yeah, it's, as I mentioned to you in an email before this, reading this book after the Keith Haring biography last year and sort of bringing re-evoking that world and understanding what it was like in a lot of different respects, not simply the artist's view on things is, to me, it's been illuminating as somebody who always lived 25 miles away from it, seeing New York at a distance all this time. But
and I like Brad Gooch's book a great deal. He was helpful to me, and we both benefited greatly from the help of the Haring archive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talk a little about Michael's art, if you can, and his involvement in the what we'll call the art world in that era. What did you make of his art, I suppose?
Well, I mean, you could overstate it and understate it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the art that I've seen, was the work of someone who, was just starting to find his voice and his own style, and his place in the art world was not necessarily as a player, but he was someone who knew a lot of people just by virtue of his chosen proximity to places like the Pyramid Club, and the fact that he had gifts as a model and a DJ, and so he was crossing paths with people like Maripol and Madonna and Basquiat. One of the things that I realized about Michael Stewart is that regardless of whether or not he had any great gifts as an artist or a model or a DJ, what he had was a certain something that allowed him to ingratiate himself with some of the most supremely gifted people of the era. And you can't understate how remarkable that is.
Yeah, it really comes across in the book. The outpouring, I guess, is not simply because somebody died. It's that somebody special to them died, and in such circumstances.
And that was it entirely, because I remember trying to find, when I was writing about Bernard Goetz, I remember trying to find references to it in the texts that I was already using, whether it was the Haring biography or the Basquiat biographies or the various diaries, and I was just going through it all to see, well, how did the East Village react to the Goetz shooting, which was far more infamous than the Stewart case. And eventually I wrote to Leon Neyfakh, who had just finished a podcast about the Goetz shooting, and I said, am I missing something here? And he said, nope. And what I concluded was that it was really an issue of, they didn't know the kids on the train, but they knew Michael.
Yeah, that comes out too in the book. It's years and years ago, 25 years ago, I published a collection of Samuel Delaney's letters from 1984 and 1985, and the Goetz shootings happened in that span, and there's his New York perspective on this Upper West Side, but a very different world than, again, everything you brought across over the course of the book. It's, again, you evoke a very, very specific time, and one that, to me is familiar at a distance. But, again, like I try to contrast that with what New York is like nowadays, and it's very, it's very difficult to contrast. I'll put it that way, or to find those points of reference, I suppose. And so much of that ties into everything you were talking about in terms of having a concentration of arts culture and other people who could just interact and know each other in a way that New York doesn't really permit now. Which is me just rambling on about gentrification. I'm sorry. That's
no, look, that's what the book's about. I mean, yeah. It's anybody who has had the experience, who was able to have the experience of being able to live in a neighborhood where the rent was pretty cheap. And, there was a lot of loft space for people to do art and to congregate, knows what a loss it is when that's not around.
Yeah. What did this book teach you about writing? What do you take from this book into your next project?
That's a good question.
I'm full of the weird ones like that. So somebody should have warned you.
Because I usually think in terms of what I've learned with reporting because I don't honestly think that much about the writing side of it, because I'm always just, editing and rewriting, but I don't think about it, if that makes sense.
No, I get you.
For me, the writing is just getting from point A to point B, and it is what it is. So I'm not actually sure what, if anything, I've learned about writing from this particular book.
Even if it was just learning that you're comfortable in that mode. And again, I'm glad you described it like that, because that's what it felt like to me, in a good way, the sense that it's all reported and it's all there in front of the reader, and it's constructed and strung together effectively and really well, and the chapter breaks and the subjects really hold up without sprawling beyond where they should. So
I mean, I guess it's not even so much something that I've learned as sort of reaffirmed, which is that I have no interest in fiction, and I am delighted to be constrained by what I can, find in an archive, or what I can get in an interview. I think I need that, because I don't have the imagination for fiction, and it's nice to find that once again.
Knowing one's lane. Are you a fiction reader particularly, or do you stick mainly to nonfiction, or Blue Sky, where I see you all the time?
I've made a much greater effort in the last year to start reading fiction again. I would say for years I've gotten in kind of a nonfiction rut. But yes, now I'm reading fiction again, and it's really nice.
Do you see yourself sticking in the true crime, we'll say true crime world, as far as your writing goes, or, considering, we'll say, biography or other directions for nonfiction?
I don't know. It's not a space that particularly interests me. I'm interested in people and in larger stories of, systems and societies and politics. So if that means that, so-called true crime stories allow me to do that, then I'll pursue it as far as that goes. But, otherwise I'm happy to see what happens. One of the reasons why probably I gravitate towards stories where there's a crime at the center of it is because oftentimes those are the ones that are catalysts for, protests and change. And, that's the stuff of a book.
Yeah. I'll be honest, I didn't even remember the bombing campaigns. I remember the protests and activists around Michael Stewart and Eleanor Bumpers and other cases like that. But when you brought in the UFF and the other group, the M19 bombing things, I'm like, wow, I don't remember this stuff at all. I find it completely plausible given the times, but
not a single person remembered those bombings, with the exception of the bombers themselves and Ron Kuby, who was defending them. But, as he said to me, look, bombs were going off up and down the East Coast. So if you're talking about a bombing where nobody was hurt, nobody's going to remember that. Yeah,
true. People remember the Brinks robbery instead over in Nanuet, where the driver was killed. So
that's right.
Yeah. I'll say it's a weird aside, but doing this show years and years ago, about 10, 12 years ago, I discovered there's a guy living in my town who was arrested for planning to bomb Fort Dix about 28 years ago, and considers himself lucky that all this happened before 9/11, because otherwise he would have been in jail for the rest of his life. Basically had, I think, 18 or 19 years in. And it was one of those, when a guest mentioned this guy to me, he's like, oh, you mentioned the town you're from, and someone else who lives in your town is this guy. I'm like, I had no idea this person lived in my town. And it was, again, late 80s, early 90s. I think he was part of another group, probably protesting I think, Central American policy for the U.S.
Yeah.
But yeah, very, very different world than what we're accustomed to now. But I wanted to ask, we talk about, and I shouldn't say true crime. In fact, both of the books that you've published so far have been around killings in particular. But going into the broader, again, we'll say true crime world, I was reading a piece of yours on the evolution of that genre, that form, as well as the intersection of race in there, and how most of the true crime world is essentially white on white issues. Can you talk a bit about A, the evolution of true crime as you see it, and B, your challenges in writing about the death of a black man in New York City? What your considerations were, I suppose, is a way of putting it.
I'm not sure about the first part, but I can answer the second part.
Okay, go into that part instead. Yeah.
I'll answer it actually by telling you I was talking to, one of the men I interviewed for the book for The Man Nobody Killed, and he said he had started reading Last Call but had put it aside because he felt that I had, despite all the reporting I had done, he said he felt like I was coming off as someone, as an outsider, mm-hmm. and that the book was written from that perspective. And he said, but that's not the case with the new book. And, for me, that was nice to hear. And, the challenges of being an outsider writing about a community, you just have to do far, far more work. Mm-hmm. And, it has to be immersive. And there's no guarantee that you're going to succeed. But I think it's the only way that you have a chance at success. I mean, this is how I feel about it. I don't know how other people feel about it, but the only thing you can really do to try and make it so that you're not treating people as a lab experiment is just to talk to as many people as you can and immerse yourselves in their experiences. Because, I can't put myself into 1983. And the only thing I can do is talk to as many people who were there and try to understand what it was like.
Is there a person?
Now, I mean, as to the systemic, as to the issues of the genre.
I'm not asking you to be a spokesman or anything.
Look, that's the last thing I consider myself, because generally, if you're a spokesperson for something, then you probably like it, and I'm the opposite of that. With Last Call, I didn't consider myself even writing a work of true crime. I always felt like I was writing a work of history, and there just happened to be a crime at the center of it. And with The Man Nobody Killed, I view it as a book about New York and about, systemic issues of, both the city level and the national level. But again, there's a crime at the center of it. It's a genre with, to this day, a lot of problems because people expect so little of it. Whether you're talking about books or podcasts, people are content with the regurgitation of the crime and of the investigations that result. And often, the project is punctuated, by the criminal going to prison, and that's it. And there's no larger consideration given to other issues. And, I despise that sort of work, and want nothing to do with it. So, when I wrote the essay for the appeal about, why the genre was so white, um, I had, I think, I had some hopes that the genre would improve after that, if people at least started talking about the problems. But I'm not at all convinced that there's been any real palpable shift.
Yeah. And right at the end of it, I mean, you really bring up the person you're quoting, talking about the market dynamics of this, ultimately pushing it. But I get you. And I think it's a very good way of framing this book. And I haven't read Last Call, although I did want to ask about the process of seeing it become a series, or being done as a television series. What that was like for you as somebody who, well, as a person who wrote the book initially, and how you saw it kind of transformed in the process into a documentary.
Well, I thought it was great. I mean,
Yeah.
for one thing, I was an executive producer on the project, and so that meant that I at least had a certain amount of artistic input, whether that meant, I could help with prepping questions for interviews. I could see rough cuts. It was basically mandated that I be involved on some level. And, that I think that probably helped a little bit. But the filmmakers were extraordinary. I never really had any concerns about the quality of the production, and they did incredible investigative work themselves and found people that I couldn't and got them on camera. So in some ways, I actually find the HBO series to be an improvement on the book.
I was going to ask whether there's, go on. Sorry.
So yeah, I'm nothing but pleased by it. And I know how lucky I am to have had a good experience there, because I know a lot of people that have had their work adapted, and very few of them have good stories.
I guess I should ask, any interest so far in The Man Nobody Killed, or is that something you can't talk about because of NDAs?
We're early in the process.
Gotcha. Okay. It's again a remarkable book, so I'd love to see how it gets, adapted, evoked, etc. Is there one person you really wish you could have interviewed, A, living, B, dead, for the book?
Yes.
Which means two people. So go on. Yeah.
Carrie Stewart, Michael's mother, who is still alive.
Yeah.
But the family was not interested in cooperating for the book for, I don't know what their reasons are, but whatever they were, I can certainly understand them.
Sure.
Ultimately being interviewed by somebody is at best a reopening of old wounds, and maybe they don't want to do that after all these years. As far as someone who is dead, I would probably Ed Koch.
Yeah.
I would say Robert Morgenthau, but I've already interviewed him.
Yeah. What would you have wanted to talk about with Koch?
Why he felt the way he did about police brutality as a systemic problem, or as he viewed it, not a systemic problem.
Yeah.
I guess I would have asked him what it would have taken for him to change his mind about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, he's a fascinating figure and an enigma, and as stories come out nowadays, it causes people to try to retroactively figure out if any of those were aspects in how he governed, I guess. But,
I mean, I didn't have a high opinion of Koch going into the book, but once I started learning about how he dealt with police brutality cases, I thought a lot less of him.
Yeah. You mentioned David Grann as one of your writing influences, and in your afterward or in your acknowledgments, you mentioned how important he was, or what it was like to have him help edit your work. Do you have meet your heroes experiences or moments? And do you have don't meet your heroes moments, which I'm always interested in hearing about?
I think I've always been lucky as far as that goes. Whether it's David or Pamela Koloff, I've mostly been lucky in that the people that I really have learned the most from have just become friends.
Yeah.
I would be hard pressed to think of someone whose work I really loved who turned out to be an asshole.
The story I always give is when I interviewed Robert McCrum and asked him this, and without skipping a beat, he said, my interview with Philip Roth was the single worst professional experience I ever had. And so I've always figured, he's going to have a sort of, you can't top this level of that stuff. But I'm glad you've had good experiences and nothing bad jumps to mind.
I've had bad experiences with interviews.
No, but people who,
but these were not people that I had, sort of personal affection for, whose work I, had some great admiration for.
Right. That's what I mean. Your heroes in that respect.
So I don't know. I've been very lucky there because, and I don't know if part of this is just that in order to be a good journalist, I think it's really hard to not on some level have a core of decency, because you have to be someone who can get people to open up about things that they really don't want to.
Yeah.
And, I find that the really good journalists are the ones who can do that.
When did you find that?
And not only that, when they stop being good journalists, which happens, it's when they stop doing that, and it's when they stop having that human connection.
Mm-hmm. When did you identify that? When did you identify that in yourself? What do you see about the ability to talk to someone and get them to open up? What did you have to learn, I guess, in the process?
I would say the very first time I really thought about what it meant to, be in front of somebody as a as a journalist and to get information out of them was reading work by Pamela Koloff. She wrote a story, it's probably 20 years ago at this point, about a priest that had been suspected of murder. And at the end of the piece, Pam goes to visit the priest and is on his, front porch, trying to interview him. And it ends with this just sort of chilling exchange between the two of them. And, that's, I think, probably when I recognized that you need to have this almost literal connection with somebody, in order to do the job at a high level.
Yeah, that's why these remote sessions just kill me. The connection that comes from looking at someone face to face and looking them in the eye when you're talking means something else. But I wasn't going to shovel through my driveway to be able to drive out to see you today, so I apologize.
That is totally fine. I mean, it's funny. I think that I used to certainly put a premium on, the in-person interviews.
Sure.
And certainly those interviews can go a long way towards building trust or exchanging documents, things like that. But I did probably 80% of the interviews I did for the book just sitting at my dining room table. And I think that sometimes it may work the other way, where if somebody's on the phone and they can't see you, then they kind of forget that there are things they probably shouldn't be saying. So things can work that way too.
Gotcha. Yeah,
the only type of interview I won't do because it's worthless is an email interview.
Yeah. Yeah, that I get. How long did the book take you ultimately from the idea to finishing the writing?
I want to say it probably took 2.5 years.
Wow.
Maybe a little longer. I mean,
This feels like one of those books that someone spent 7 years on. Not in the page count, but in the thoroughness of it. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, because I didn't learn the story until after Last Call came out, which was almost exactly 4 years ago. And then I probably spent 6 months on the proposal. I think I ended up interviewing about 40 people just for the proposal.
Wow.
And I don't know, once I got the contract, it was probably another year and 3 months. I'm not sure what that adds up to, but
yeah, you're not talking about 7 years like I was expecting to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I worked on it
yeah,
almost every day, always making phone calls, always writing. I wasn't working really on anything else. So that was the job.
Yeah, do you have I'll say routine around that? I know some of it has to be built on when your sources are available to talk, but
no, yeah. I don't have a routine because you never know when you're going to find a document you need. You never know when someone's going to pick up a phone, and I can't write unless the material is there for the writing. So, I'm not like Gay Talese going down in my basement from 9 to 6. It doesn't work like that. I mean, I know there are writers who really segment the process, and the first half of it will be the reporting, and then the second half of it is the writing. And for me, that's happening concurrently the whole time.
Yeah. How late was the reporting going into how close was it to the end, I suppose?
Well, it wasn't one of those things where I had something that was, necessary to finish the book. I mean, that was all, pretty much done in part because I had just done so much work on the front end.
Sure.
But there's always stuff I'm, curious about and want to know more and always have follow-up questions. And so it goes right up to it continues until it doesn't.
Understood. I think you made a really fantastic book out of this process. So just keep doing what you're doing as far as I'm concerned. I did want to tell you, though, a few days ago and this is completely tangential, on Blue Sky, you mentioned basically the thread of who's the worst person to share your first name. You, of course, have it easy. I'm really stuck because I don't think Gil Hodges or Gil Gerard were assholes or anything. I really can't come up with a Gil who's a terrible person. So thank you for launching that meme, but also leaving me in a complete quandary because I might be the worst Gil out there, I think. So,
well, look, I wish I was in your shoes.
Yeah. Anybody named Don is really, trouble too. But the last question I have, and I should have prepared you for this. I apologize for not doing that. What have you been reading?
Well, the last novel I finished is Zeal by my friend Morgan Jerkins.
Mm-hmm.
It is a remarkable story that takes place over about 160 years. It's a romance that goes from Reconstruction, a Reconstruction era Confederacy all the way up to pandemic era New York.
I'm looking it up. It looks amazing, and coming out in April.
Incredible, okay. Yes.
And what else? Fiction, nonfiction, poetry, whatever you're.
No, that's it. I actually don't have the capacity to read more than one thing at a time. So.
Gotcha. I'll give this one a look, and I might end up hitting you up for some info from. To try to reach out to Morgan too. So in the meantime, I want to thank you, A, for this book, B, for sending me back to early 80s New York, which honestly, if you brought in like Igel Vesti, Donald Maness, and Howard Stern, that would have been my entire youth, all captured right there on the page.
Well,
in a sense,
Igel Vesti is in Last Call.
I sort of thought that would be the case. I haven't read it, and I saw the era. I figured that's after his death, but of a piece, I guess. Anyway, you've given me back part of my youth, and you've also illuminated an incredible story here. So I want to thank you for all that. And Elon, thanks for coming on the show.
You're very welcome.
And that was Elon Green. Go get The Man Nobody Killed, Life, Death, and Art in Michael Stewart's New York. It's out now from Celadon Books. It's riveting. It is deeply researched, and it's vital for our times. It's a remarkable book, so go get that. You can find out more about Elon at his site, elongreen.com, which is ELONGREEN.com. And like I said, in our conversation, he's active on Blue Sky as Elon Green, all one word. He's also got an Instagram account, which is elon.green, but that's private, and I haven't requested entry. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.